The Last Stand. The HFY fleet drifted in the cold darkness of space, surrounded on all sides by the monstrous warships of the Zorvax Empire, their towering, spiked hulls gleaming under the faint light of the distant star. The battlefield was nothing but a graveyard of shattered ships, the debris of fallen warriors floating aimlessly, a silent reminder of the hopelessness that had already settled into the hearts of those who still remained. Commander Keeler, a seasoned HFY leader, stood in the command center of his battered flagship, his fingers gripping the edges of the holodeble as he studied the battle reports with a sinking heart. His people were losing. No, they had already lost. Only death remained now. The Zorvax had attacked without mercy, their warships cutting through HFY defenses like a blade slicing through flesh, overwhelming them with sheer numbers, brutal firepower, and an unshakable thirst for conquest. The HFY had fought back with everything they had, launching desperate counterattacks, forming tight defensive formations, using every tactical maneuver they knew. But it had not been enough. One by one, their ships had fallen, each explosion a silent scream, each fading signal a reminder that they were now nothing more than a dying race, standing at the edge of extinction. A deep, rumbling voice echoed through the command deck as the Zorvax leader, Warlord Krax, transmitted a message directly to the HFY fleet, his tone laced with arrogance and cruelty. HFY, your time is over. Your warriors are dead, your fleet is shattered, and your world will burn. Surrender now, and I will grant you the mercy of chains instead of the cold embrace of the void. Silence filled the command deck as the crew exchanged desperate, fearful glances. They had fought for so long, endured so much, but the truth was undeniable. There was no escape. The enemy had them surrounded, their weapons locked and ready to fire. Keeler could see the exhaustion in the eyes of his soldiers, the quiet resignation in their faces, the understanding that this was the end of the road. He took a deep breath, his mind racing as he weighed his options. There were none. To surrender meant to become slaves, forced to serve under the brutal rule of the Zorvax, stripped of their pride, their freedom, their very identity. To fight meant certain death, a final stand that would end in nothing but silence. But perhaps it was better to die with honor than to live in chains. "Commander," one of the officers whispered, his voice trembling. "What do we do?" Keeler straightened, his gaze hardening with determination. "We fight," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "If this is our last day, then let the Zorvax remember us not as cowards, but as warriors who chose to stand." The crew straightened at his words, their fear replaced by something else, a final, desperate resolve. They were going to die, but they would die fighting, taking as many enemies with them as they could. Orders were shouted, weapons powered up, and the remaining HFY ships prepared for one final charge, one last blaze of defiance before the darkness consumed them. And then, the sensors detected something, a sudden spike in energy, a ripple in space, a distortion at the edge of the battlefield. Keeler frowned, his mind struggling to process the readings flashing across the screen. What is that?" Before anyone could answer, the void itself seemed to tremble, and from the darkness, they emerged, massive warships, unfamiliar and monstrous, appearing out of nowhere like specters of vengeance. The Zorvax fleet hesitated. The HFY froze. For the first time in the entire battle, the enemy showed uncertainty. The unidentified ships were unlike anything Keeler had ever seen. Sleek, armored behemoths bristling with weapons, their hulls pulsing with an ominous, unnatural glow. They moved with terrifying precision, engines roaring as they advanced, positioning themselves between the HFY and the Zorvax. A transmission crackled through the bridge, but the voice that followed was not HFY. It was something else, something that sent chills down Keeler's spine. "This is the Terran fleet. Stand down, or be destroyed." For the first time, Warlord Krax did not respond. For the first time, the Zorvax hesitated. And for the first time, in a long, long time, Commander Keeler felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Hope. The battlefield was frozen in silence. The Selvari fleet, battered and barely holding together, drifted in place, their weapons still locked onto the enemy. The Zorvax warships, once so full of confidence and overwhelming power, now hesitated, their formations breaking ever so slightly. And in between them stood the newcomers, human warships, massive and terrifying, their dark hulls reflecting the distant light of the stars, their weapons humming with an energy unlike anything the Selvari or Zorvax had ever seen before. Commander Keeler's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the screens before him, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The humans, the Terran fleet, had arrived. But why? What were they doing in this part of space? How had they even known about this battle? A sharp crackle of static filled the command deck as a voice cut through the silence, the same voice that had sent a chill through Keeler's spine only moments ago. Zorvax warships, this is Admiral Duran of the Terran fleet. You have two choices, retreat now or be wiped from existence. There will be no third option. The words were cold, calm, and filled with the kind of confidence that only came from absolute certainty. The Zorvax, who had never known fear, who had conquered and crushed countless civilizations without resistance, did not respond. Instead, their warships powered up their weapons. The Selvari braced themselves. If the Zorvax refused to stand down, then the battle would continue, but this time, with an unknown force in play. Warlord Krax's deep, guttural voice finally echoed through the comms, filled with anger and arrogance. Humans, this is not your war. Leave now, or die alongside the weaklings you wish to protect. Keeler's fingers clenched into fists. The Zorvax were not going to surrender. He had fought them long enough to know that they never backed down, never retreated, never showed mercy. The arrival of the Terran fleet might have changed the battle, but it was not over yet. A tense silence followed Krax's challenge. The human warships remained still, their movements calculated and patient, like a predator watching its prey. Keeler could feel the anticipation rising among his crew. What would the humans do? Would they leave? Would they fight? Then the humans answered. Without warning, the largest Terran warship fired. A single, blinding beam of energy shot across the void, striking the Zorvax battlecruiser directly in its center. The ship did not explode. It did not suffer a slow, agonizing breakdown like the Selvari ships usually did under Zorvax fire. It was simply erased. One moment it was there. The next, it was gone. The battlefield fell into a stunned silence. The Selvari, the Zorvax, even Keeler himself, all watched in horror as the first true blow of the new battle was delivered. The Zorvax had lost an entire warship in a fraction of a second. For the first time since the war began, Warlord Krax hesitated. Keeler's breath caught in his throat. The humans had technology beyond anything they had ever seen. No energy readings, no projectile impact, no signs of an explosion, just destruction beyond understanding. But the humans weren't finished. That was a warning. Admiral Duran's voice came again, completely calm, completely certain. You get one more chance. Retreat, or the next shot won't be your smallest ship. Keeler's eyes flickered to the main display. The Zorvax fleet was moving now, but not toward retreat, toward attack. They were preparing to fight. And so were the humans. The Terran warships adjusted their positions, their engines glowing with energy, their weapons charging in ways Keeler had never seen before. A deep, heavy hum filled the command deck, coming not from their own ships, but from the sheer power resonating through space from the human fleet. The battle that was supposed to end in Selvari extinction had just changed completely. And this time, the Zorvax were no longer the most powerful force in the fight. The battlefield was no longer silent. The moment the Terran fleet fired its first shot, everything changed. The Zorvax, a species that had spent centuries crushing weaker civilizations, had just witnessed one of their strongest warships vanish in an instant. But instead of retreating, They did what they always did. They prepared to fight. Commander Keeler watched the display with clenched fists. The Selvari fleet was barely holding together. They had lost more than half their ships. Their weapons were overheated, their shields flickering, their crews exhausted. If the humans had not arrived, this would have been their final hour. But now something had shifted. The Zorvax, for the first time, looked uncertain. Warlord Krax's deep, snarling voice filled the comms. "Terrans, you have made a mistake. You believe one shot will make us flee." There was anger in his voice, but beneath it, there was something else. Something Keeler had never expected from the Zorvax. Doubt. Admiral Duran's voice returned, calm and unshaken. "Your kind is used to fighting weaker enemies, Warlord. That ends today." Then the real battle began. The Zorvax fleet opened fire all at once. Hundreds of energy beams and plasma torpedoes streaked across the void, heading straight for the human warships. The sheer firepower should have been enough to annihilate an entire fleet in seconds. It was the kind of attack that had wiped out thousands of civilizations before. But the Terran fleet did not move. They did not attempt to dodge. They did not activate emergency shields. They let the attacks hit them. Keeler's breath caught in his throat as the first wave of Zorvax fire struck the human warships directly, and did nothing. The plasma torpedoes detonated against the human hulls, but there were no explosions, no damage, no weakening of defenses. The energy beams, powerful enough to melt entire moons, simply disappeared the moment they touched the Terran ships. It was as if the very fabric of space around them refused to let them be harmed. Warlord Krax's voice returned, but now there was no arrogance, only confusion. Impossible. The Terran fleet finally moved. With a quiet hum, the largest human warship began to drift forward. It was massive, far larger than any Zorvax battlecruiser, its dark surface absorbing the light around it like a void in space. It was slow but deliberate, a predator closing in on its wounded prey. And then it fired. Not a beam, not a missile, not plasma, just a pulse. A deep echoing wave of energy rippled outward from the Terran flagship. It was invisible to the naked eye, but every sensor on the battlefield screamed with warnings. Keeler's screens filled with errors as the energy disrupted every system within range. And then, one by one, the Zorvax ships began shutting down. Engines flickered and died. Shields collapsed. Weapons systems powered down. The unstoppable Zorvax war machine was helpless. Warlord Krax roared over the comms. "Restore power. Fire. Fire." But it was no use. The Zorvax, who had spent centuries conquering, now found themselves completely vulnerable. Keeler couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The humans had shut down an entire fleet with a single pulse. How? What kind of technology did they have? How could they wield such power so easily? The answer came from Admiral Duran, whose voice once again cut through the silence. "Zorvax fleet, you are no longer in control of this battle. You never were." One of the Zorvax warships suddenly exploded from within. Its engines, now overloaded with uncontrolled energy, tore the ship apart from the inside. The same thing happened to another ship, then another. One by one, the Zorvax fleet was tearing itself apart, not because the humans had fired at them, but because their own technology was failing under the weight of what the humans had done. Warlord Krax's voice was no longer filled with rage. It was panic. "Terrans, what are you?" Admiral Duran finally gave his answer. "We are the species you should have never provoked." The battle was over. And for the first time in history, the Zorvax were the ones begging for mercy. The battlefield was unrecognizable. Where once the Zorvax fleet had stood, mighty and unstoppable, now there was only chaos and silence. Their warships, once symbols of terror, now drifted aimlessly, their power drained, their systems locked in failure. Some ships had already exploded from within, unable to handle the backlash of their own technology. The once proud conquerors were helpless. Commander Keeler had thought he knew war. He had fought in battles, seen entire fleets burned away, witnessed the horrors of interstellar conflict. But this was something else. This was not just victory. This was domination. And the humans had done it without even trying. The comm channels were filled with Zorvak's distress signals, overlapping cries for help, desperate attempts to reestablish control. The Selvari fleet, who had moments ago believed they would face total extinction, now watched in stunned silence. The Terran fleet had changed everything. Admiral Duran's voice echoed through the comms again, steady and calm. Zorvak's fleet, you are no longer a threat. Your weapons are useless. Your defenses are shattered. Surrender now. Warlord Krax did not answer. For the first time, the feared leader of the Zorvaks had no words. He could not understand what had just happened. He could not comprehend how, in a matter of minutes, the war had been decided without a fight. His species had always been the strongest. They had crushed empires, reduced civilizations to dust, made entire star systems bow before them. How had the humans, these creatures they had barely acknowledged, become something far beyond their understanding? His second in command, General Vorkesh, stared at the dead control panels before him. His claws trembled. Warlord, we cannot fight this. Krax turned on him, his rage barely contained. You would surrender. Vorkesh hesitated, but the truth was undeniable. They had already lost. The humans had shut down their fleet with a single pulse of energy. They had not taken a single casualty. Their warships stood undamaged, their weapons fully operational, while the Zorvaks had been reduced to stranded wrecks in space. If the Terrans had wanted to, they could have obliterated them. But they had not. Keeler watched as the silence stretched between the fleets. He knew what was happening aboard the Zorvaks warships. He could picture the crew, warriors who had never known fear, now staring at their powerless weapons, at their failing systems, at the looming shadows of the Terran warships, realizing they had finally met something greater than themselves. The humans had not just won. They had done something far more terrifying. They had shown mercy, and somehow that was worse than complete destruction. Keeler exhaled slowly. This is the moment. If the Zorvaks refused to surrender, if they still tried to fight back, the Terrans would not hesitate to finish this war. His hands clenched into fists. He turned toward the screen displaying the Terran fleet and pressed the comm button. Admiral Duran. The human commander's face appeared, calm, unreadable. Keeler took a deep breath. We, the HFY, acknowledge the Terran fleet as our saviors. If not for you, we would have perished. He hesitated for a moment, then added, I do not know why you saved us, but I will not forget it. Duran gave a small nod. The Zorvaks have spread too much destruction. We could not stand by and watch. A pause. Then, Keeler spoke the words he had never imagined saying. Will you fight alongside us to end them? For a moment, there was silence. Then Duran gave his answer. We already have. And at that moment, Keeler understood. This was only the beginning. The Zorvaks Empire, which had ruled unchecked for centuries, had made a mistake far greater than they realized. They had challenged humanity. And now, for the first time in their history, they were the ones who should be afraid. The Zorvaks fleet was broken. Their warships drifted in silence, powerless and defenseless, while the massive Terran fleet stood like a wall of judgment before them. The HFY, once certain of their own destruction, now watched in awe. They had seen miracles before, but this was something else. Keeler could still hear the panicked voices of Zorvaks officers across the open comm channels. Some were begging for orders, others were arguing in desperation, but none of them had a solution. Their weapons were dead, their engines locked, and their technology, once the pride of their empire, was now useless against human power. And the worst part, the humans had not fired a single shot. The Zorvaks warlord, Krax, sat in stunned silence aboard his command ship. His claws gripped the arms of his throne, his eyes staring at the empty tactical screens before him. He had led 1,000 battles. He had crushed species beneath his fleet, burned planets to dust, and forced empires into submission. But now, for the first time in his life, he was the one with no options. A voice crackled through his failing systems. It was Admiral Duran. Warlord Krax. The human's voice was steady, unwavering. Your fleet is defeated. You have no weapons. You have no control. Surrender now. Krax's teeth clenched. Surrender? He had never surrendered in his life. The Zorvax Empire had never bowed to anyone. But what choice did he have? General Vorkesh stood at his side, watching him carefully. Warlord, we must decide. Krax let out a slow, heavy breath. We do not surrender. Vorkesh stiffened. Then what do we do? Krax's eyes burned with anger. We wait. Because deep in his mind, there was still a flicker of hope. The Zorvax Empire was vast. Their fleets stretched across multiple sectors. This was only one battle. The humans may have won this fight, but Krax refused to believe they could win a war against the full force of his empire. But then, the Terrans made their next move. A massive holographic projection appeared in front of every remaining Zorvax officer, filling their failing screens. It was not a threat, not a demand, but something far worse. It was a live feed from deep inside Zorvax space, and what they saw made their blood turn cold. Human warships were already there. Massive Terran dreadnoughts hovered over Zorvax planets. Military outposts had been surrounded. Key supply lines had been cut. And in every sector, human ships moved with absolute precision, as if they had planned this for years. The Zorvax hadn't just lost a battle. They had already lost the war. Keeler, still aboard his Zelveri warship, watched in shock as the images spread across the enemy fleet. He could feel it. The moment true fear set in. The Zorvax officers, once arrogant and sure of their strength, now realized the truth. The humans had not reacted to their invasion. They had anticipated it. You are surrounded. Admiral Duran's voice echoed again, calm but final. Your empire's power is broken. Surrender now, or there will be no empire left to save. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Keeler could only imagine what was going through Warlord Krax's mind. The fear, the disbelief, the crushing weight of realizing that the Zorvax were not the superior force they thought they were. Then, finally, a single, heavy transmission came through. Warlord Krax's voice, cold and defeated, spoke 3 words no Zorvax had ever spoken before. We surrender. And with that, the war was over. Or so they thought. Because deep in the void, in the shadows of forgotten systems, something else was waiting. Something that even the humans had not predicted. And the real fight was only just beginning. The Zorvax warships floated motionless in space, their weapons powered down, their systems overridden by the humans. What was once a mighty fleet of conquest had now been reduced to helpless wreckage. The Zelveri, who had believed their civilization was lost, could barely comprehend what had happened. On that Zelveri flagship, Keeler watched the surrender unfold, his heart still racing. He had spent years preparing for his people's extinction, watching world after world fall under the Zorvax's ruthless advance. And yet, in a single battle, the humans had undone everything. How? Keeler wasn't sure whether to feel relief or fear. He had no doubt that the humans had saved them. But what kind of power could break an empire so easily? The answer came sooner than he expected. The humans were not done. Aboard the massive Terran command ship, Admiral Duran stood in front of a vast tactical display. The Zorvax were finished, but Duran's expression was grim, not victorious. His officers worked in silence, scanning data, running calculations. They knew something the others did not. This war was not over. Duran turned to his second-in-command, Captain Rains. Tell them. Rains nodded, opening a transmission across the sector. Not just to the Zorvax, but to the Zelveri as well. The message came through in an instant. All forces, prepare for incoming hostiles. A stunned silence fell over the Selvari bridge. Keeler's throat tightened. Incoming hostiles. A Zorvax officer, one of the prisoners taken aboard a Terran vessel, suddenly let out a low growl. "You don't understand," the officer hissed. "We were never meant to win this battle. We were never supposed to win this war." Keeler turned sharply. "What do you mean?" The Zorvax's eyes gleamed with something new, not defiance, not anger, but fear. "The High Council sent us here to die." The words chilled Keeler to the core. Joran's voice cut through the comms again. "They're coming." At that moment, the sensors screamed with alerts. Something was emerging from deep space. Not a fleet, not a rescue force. A weapon. A massive rift opened at the edge of the system, dark and unnatural, swirling like a black hole. From its depths, something terrifying emerged. It was not a Zorvax warship. It was something far older, something not meant to exist. The Devourer had arrived. The Zorvax prisoners froze, their bodies trembling. Even Warlord Krax, still aboard his crippled flagship, stared in horror at the monstrous shape drifting into real space. It was not a single ship. It was a hive. A planet-sized, shifting mass of living metal, its surface crawling with millions of smaller entities. It had no engines, no visible weapons, and yet every sensor screamed warnings of imminent death. The Zorvax had never intended to conquer the Selvari. They had intended to offer them as a sacrifice. Keeler's blood turned to ice. The humans had saved them from the Zorvax. But could they save them from this? Admiral Joran's voice remained calm. All Terran forces, battle stations, and the real war began. The Selvari had thought the worst was over. They had believed that the Zorvax were the greatest threat they would ever face. But now, as the monstrous, planet-sized hive emerged from the rift, the truth became clear. The Zorvax were nothing compared to this. Keeler stood frozen, watching the nightmarish mass drift into real space. It was alive. It pulsed and shifted, its metallic surface writhing like a nest of insects, millions of smaller entities crawling across its body. The sensors on that Selvari flagship glitched and failed just trying to scan it. It was like the universe itself was rejecting its existence. The Devourer had arrived. The Zorvax prisoners on board the Terran fleet trembled in horror. They knew what was coming. They had never been the true rulers of the galaxy. They had been servants, slaves to something older and far worse. Warlord Krax, still aboard his crippled warship, finally understood. The High Council had never sent them to conquer. They had sent them to die. He growled in rage, smashing his fist against the nearest console. They had used him. They had used his fleet as a distraction. The humans had been strong enough to destroy him. But would they survive what came next? Keeler turned toward Admiral Joran, his voice unsteady. "Can you fight this?" Joran did not answer immediately. His cold blue eyes studied the readings on his holo display, analyzing the enemy with a level of calm that felt inhuman. Finally, he spoke. "We've fought worse." The Selvari officers stared in disbelief. Worse? What could be worse than this? Before anyone could question further, the Devourer attacked. It did not fire energy weapons. It did not launch missiles. It simply extended. From its shifting, grotesque surface, thousands of tendrils shot forward, stretching across the void like living spears. Each tendril was composed of millions of micro-machines, intelligent, self-replicating, consuming everything in their path. One of the disabled Zorvax ships was the first to be hit. The tendrils wrapped around it, and within seconds, the mighty battleship was gone. Not destroyed, not exploded, absorbed. Its metal was stripped away, its energy core ripped from its hull. The crew didn't even have time to scream before their bodies were reduced to raw biological material, devoured by the swarm. A second Zorvax vessel suffered the same fate. Then a third. The Selvari officers gasped in horror. Keeler gripped the edges of the console so tightly his fingers ached. This wasn't war. This was annihilation. And then the human fleet moved. Admiral Joran gave no speech, no declaration, no warning. He simply attacked. The first Terran warships fired, unleashing weapons unlike anything the HFY had ever seen. Massive pulse cannons roared to life, each blast releasing a contained explosion of antimatter that ripped through the tendrils, erasing them from existence. Railguns fired at near-light speed, their kinetic rounds striking with the force of entire planetary bombardments. Plasma torpedoes detonated, their heat so intense that even the Devourer's shifting form struggled to repair itself fast enough. The void exploded with war. And for the first time, the Devourer hesitated. It had consumed thousands of civilizations before. It had devoured entire star systems. It had never known resistance. But now it faced something different. It faced humanity. Aboard the Terran flagship, Captain Rains smiled grimly as he watched the Devourer's form shift and falter under the relentless assault. "It bleeds," he muttered. "That means we can kill it." But Joran wasn't smiling. His fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair, his mind calculating at incredible speed. He knew the truth. This was not a victory. Not yet. The Devourer was learning. Even as it took damage, it was adapting. Its form shifted, its tendrils retracting, its mass reforming into something denser, harder, more resistant to attack. The antimatter blasts that had torn through it before now struggled to break through its surface. The kinetic rounds that had shattered it moments ago barely made a dent. It was evolving. Fast. Too fast. Joran's jaw tightened. "All ships, fall back." Captain Rains turned sharply. "Admiral, fall back." Joran's voice was firm. "We can't win like this." Keeler stared in disbelief. They were retreating. The Devourer's mass began to expand again, its tendrils reforming, reaching for the Terran fleet. But the humans were already moving. Their ships, faster and more maneuverable than anything that HFY had ever seen, vanished into space, slipping just beyond the Devourer's grasp. Keeler's heart pounded. They had struck a blow, but the battle was far from over. He turned to Joran, his voice urgent. "What now?" Joran exhaled slowly. "Now." He glanced at the holographic map, where the monstrous entity loomed like a black hole at the edge of the system. "Now we kill it for good." Keeler's breath caught. The war was not over. But for the first time, the Devourer had something to fear. Humanity was coming for it.